Okay, the meeting is running. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Town Council Budget Workshop for Thursday, May 7th. And this is another one of our remote meetings. And if you would kindly join me for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. We are going to move on now to public comment. And this portion of the meeting is specifically set aside for public comments from the public who are asked to limit their comments to 2 minutes. Any person interested in providing public comment should email publicmeetings@rockyhillct.gov. You will be provided with a link to attend the Zoom remote meeting and instructions on how you will participate. And at this moment, I'm seeing that we have no public comment in the queue. So we are going to move forward with our Board of Education workshop presentation. And I'm going to pull up my agenda. And so we're going to be focusing on the Board of Education, which is in pages 92 to 93 of the proposed, and the capital improvements, Section 1, Board of Education, which you'll find on page 102, and Section 2, which you will find on pages 100 through 100 each. And so I'm going to turn it over to the board at this time.
Okay, let me, Brian Dillon, Chairperson, Board of Ed, just let me start by saying thank you to the council for having us here tonight. Hopefully this format works without too many complications in it. I know Mark has his presentation ready to go. So once again, thank you for having us here tonight for our budget presentation. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Zeno to present the board's budget. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dillon. I appreciate having you here this evening along with our other board members, and we certainly appreciate the opportunity to address the council and explain factors involved in the board's adoption of the 2020-2021 fiscal year budget. As you know, this is a two-part budget. It includes operating funds, and it also includes a request for capital improvements. Also with us here tonight, in the appropriately socially distanced away from me, are Chuck Zettergren, our Assistant Superintendent for Finance, and Darlene Listro, our Assistant Superintendent for Curriculum and Instruction. And Ron LaMontagne is participating, if needed, remotely for any questions that may pertain to the capital improvement plan. With that being said, Mr. Murphy, if you could bring up the slides, I can take the council through the overview of the budget, and then we can open it up for questions for Mr. Dillon and for myself and any other member of the team that may be of assistance. So, John, if you can go to the next slide. Thank you very much. So as we begin our budget process every year in the fall, we typically have a series of assumptions that the board adopts moving forward. And they're pretty standard, and you'd find these in most school districts. We want to continue to provide the kids with high quality teaching and learning experiences. We want to continue to improve teaching and learning, and that's really based upon making sure that we have a rigorous curriculum. We also may keep a very careful eye on our enrollment so that we can keep our staffing levels where they need to be in terms of conforming with the board guidelines. Students are very busy. Teachers and students require instructional supplies. That's another fundamental assumption when we build the budget. We spend a lot of time in Rocky Hill focusing on maintaining safe and adequate facilities, making sure the equipment, fixtures, furniture, and so forth are what the kids need to promote high quality learning. And the board over the last several years has taken a very keen interest in promoting educational technology. And I have to give the board credit for that, because I don't think anybody could have predicted the abrupt transition to online virtual learning that we've seen with this outbreak of the coronavirus across the country. To the board's credit, they had already started a one-to-one student device initiative that really came in handy, because when we had to close the schools down on March 13th, and transition to the online learning program, we were able to send every student in grades 2 through 12 home with a device on the last day of actual in-person learning. And within the next several weeks, we were able to roll out devices to the students in kindergarten and also in first grade. So we've done really well with that piece, but it's been critically important this year. And again, we couldn't have predicted that, but the board and their efforts to stay focused on technology really put the district in a good situation to deal with this unprecedented crisis. John, if you could go to the next slide. So this particular budget, again, as I mentioned, keeps staffing levels in accordance with board guidelines, deals with all of the costs that are associated with special education. I'll speak about that a little bit later in the presentation. Includes funding for all of the board's negotiated labor contracts and continues to support curricular initiatives. And again, off to the right-hand side on the slide, you see that we're focused on curriculum, educational technology, adequate facilities, using data to inform our instruction. I'll talk a little bit about student data during this presentation as well. Next slide. So the overall budget increase is 4.29%. There are 4 primary factors driving this budget increase for the board. Salaries, about 83% of the overall cost of running the district is related to people. About 2/3 of the cost, 67%, is salaries, and another 16% is targeted for health insurance cost. That's pretty standard in most school districts. Anywhere between 80 to 85% of the operating budget is related to employees and personnel because it's a people-intensive industry. We also have rising costs in transportation. When we opened Mosier School, there were some issues with crowding on the buses, and the board needed to add 3 additional buses to the bus fleet. So we see an increase there. And then with supplies and utilities, we do see an increase going into next year's budget as well, primarily due to the opening of Mosier, adding that 5th building. We saw an increase in energy costs. Next slide, please. John, can you go to that? There you go. Thank you. So this slide just demonstrates our historical enrollment. And if you want to go back later and take a peek at it, it's pretty interesting. Back in the 2013-2014 school year, we had a little over 2,400 students. This is the first year, this year's October 1 enrollment count, the first year where we actually saw a decline in enrollment over the last 6 years. Since 2013-2014, the school district had grown about 13.5%, which is massive growth, over 300 students in that period. That would explain why we had the 16 portable classrooms split between West Hill and Stevens. By the way, we've reduced that number down to 8 at this point. And it also was the primary factor for the board's desire to build Mosier School. That's really, really significant growth during a time when many Connecticut school districts are experiencing a decline in growth. But this historical data is really interesting if you want to take some time later on to analyze it. I'm going to draw out some key points in the next slide, if you could go there, John. The October 1 date is the apples to apples comparison we use every year throughout Connecticut to look at our enrollment. So I looked back at October 1 of 2018, and that was our high point, 2,748 students. And we saw a bit of a dip this year. This year's October 1 number, you can see there, 2,697. That's a decrease of 51 students. So where we were experiencing roughly 2.5% to 3% growth every year for the past 5 or 6 years, we're starting to see those numbers playing off. However, I went in again today and checked on enrollment, and we're back up to 2,744. So again, that's a sign to me when we look back to 2018 and we look to today's number, very stable, 2,744. So the overall number is stable, but I want to draw your attention to the bottom of the slide as well. What I've also done is I've taken a look at students that are new to Rocky Hill that are not part of an incoming kindergarten cohort. We average about 200 students per year coming in kindergarten, and roughly 200 or 180 to 200 graduates, depending on the size of the class. I think most years 185 is a good guess. So that's where we've seen some of the growth if you compare those two numbers. But look at the number for 18-19, 277 new students to Rocky Hill. This year, to date, 302 new students. Those are non-kindergarten kids. But we also have to talk about out-migration when we look at that. We see a similar number exiting the district each year. So the point of the story here is this is a community with a relatively high rate of transiency. We know we're going to have 200 kindergarten kids coming in every year. We know we're going to lose 180 or so seniors when they graduate. However, we're also seeing high 200s to 300 kids coming in and the same number exiting at the non-K level, if that makes sense. I point that out because it does create issues in terms of transiency. We see an increased number of students with English language learning needs, for example. So it's just a unique factor in Rocky Hill that I don't see in other districts when I look at this stuff. Next slide, please. So when we look at projected enrollment, it's like a weather forecast. And what draws my attention here, short term, a projected growth of 64 students over the next 2 years in the pre-kindergarten to grade 12. So these cohort analysis development are done by the New England School Development Council. They do what's called a persistence measurement. They want to track students year over year. And they look at factors like birth rate, housing sales in the community, building permits, in-migration patterns, out-migration patterns. They're generally pretty accurate. And they do predict that we're going to grow by about 60 kids over the next 2 years, which I think is not a huge number given what we've had to deal with in the past. So I think the enrollment is starting to level out a little bit. We're not seeing the massive increase that we were seeing on a year-to-year basis over the last 5 years. So maybe we're catching a bit of a break, but we want to track this for a couple of more years to see if there's a pattern here. Next slide, please. Now, another data point we really like to look at is how is the school district doing compared to the dollars we're spending? So one of the factors we always want to look at is student performance on these state assessments. So in this particular slide, we're looking at a couple of data points here. First of all, we're looking at all of the towns that are in District Reference Group D. The state has grouped us with 23 other communities, and it's based on the fact that we have a similar economic profile. So when we look at this group, I have them rank ordered by per pupil expenditure. There's 24 communities in this slide. Rocky Hill is 19th in spending. We're spending about $15,500 per child. You can see right up at the top, Old Saybrook is spending over $21,000 per child. So we're 19th in spending. So that stays consistent when we make these comparisons. Where you also see the column with the violet color, any district that's shaded in violet is a district that our students are outperforming. So if you look at English language arts, for example, the only district doing a little bit better than Rocky Hill is Stonington. We're beating everybody else. But again, we're 19th in spending and second in ELA performance. The same holds true in math. Colchester slightly ahead of Rocky Hill in math results. However, Rocky Hill grades 3 through 8, beating every other community in the district reference group and still 19th in spending. So that's really powerful in terms of getting a high value, high performance from the students, producing excellent results at a really reasonable cost. The next slide, if you could go to that, John, demonstrates our high school. And we are not as strong there. We're the first to admit that. Although the math scores are pretty competitive, we're still ahead of the district reference group average, the mean score for these 24 towns, 19th in spending, which is consistent. And you can see where we are in both math and in English language arts, the verbal portion of the test for those old school people like me on the SAT. We're still above the state average and still above the district average. So for this group of 24 towns, we're exceeding the average. We are focused on trying to make some more improvements at the high school. But again, these are still very competitive results. And again, the cost is very efficient. Go to the next slide, please. This slide here is a demonstration of efficiency in terms of how we allocate our special education dollars in Rocky Hill. So of the 24 communities in DIRG D, we're ranked 4th in terms of efficiency. We're using about 20% of our overall operating budget to cover special ed costs. I'm going to talk in some more detail later on about special education. But again, this is just another indicator that we're pretty efficient with the dollars we receive. We're really trying to make wise decisions in terms of protecting the integrity of the taxpayer dollar. And you see that reflected here in this particular slide. Next slide, please. So the big picture of this budget is a $46.6 million adopted board budget. It's an increase of almost $2 million from last year. It's a percentile increase of 4.29%. John? When we take the 4.29% and we break that out, I like to analyze that from the standpoint of what is actually driving that cost increase. So 3/4 of that increase is salaries. You see that there. It's about $1.4 million. It's a combination of new staffing to some extent and more towards negotiated salary and wage increases in contracts. Benefits are up $341,000. Transportation, as I mentioned, is up. That's a combined number. It's 3 new buses, and it's also a 2.75% increase in the transportation contract for next year. The supplies and utilities, as I touched upon earlier, also increased primarily as a result of Mosier coming online, that 5th building, additional square footage that needs to be cooled and heated and so forth. However, there are some significant offsets in this budget too, primarily related to tuition, and that gets back to some of the issues with special education that I'll touch upon later on. But the overall picture here is almost a $2 million increase, 4.29% overall. Next slide, please. So in terms of staffing that will be coming on board in the fall, you see the new staff. 1.2 of those positions are dedicated to special education. The board had asked me to analyze the numbers in special ed last year during the budget. Over the past 4 or 5 years, we've gone from roughly 250 students with special needs to around 400. So they reinstated the supervisor position that previously existed for many years. That person came in mid-year, so it was only a half salary. So next year, when the full calendar year is taken into consideration, the other half of that salary kicks in. So that's why you see a 0.5 supervisor position. We also have a 0.5 nurse. That will actually be a part-time nurse. Again, we have some students with severe medical needs that require transportation with nursing services included in the transportation. And then we have a sliver, about $15,000 or so for OT and PT services. That's occupational therapy and physical therapy. Basically just an increase in hours for some personnel due to the increased needs of the kids. And then we have a half a secretary position in the budget. 2 years ago, when we were planning on opening Mosier School and then going into the budget for the current fiscal year, we had to make some pretty tough decisions. And we moved 2 full-time personnel, essentially out of Darlene Listro's department, over to Mosier to help open that school and minimize the budget impact. And I had gone back to the board. There's been a bit of a setback there. We're looking to reinstate a half a position out of the 2 people we moved to provide some support for the curriculum office. So you see that half-time secretary reflected. And then you could see what the budget would look like prior to those new positions. Would have been a 3.95% increase. And with the additions, it brings it up to 4.29. Next slide. So the other factor in this budget in terms of salaries is we have a special education director, Ms. Stevenson, who's been with us. This is her 3rd year. She's done a really good job in terms of thinking creatively and working with the board subcommittee on special education and looking at the bottom line in terms of being efficient with dollars. So last year, in conversations with the board, we had a number of committee meetings and then gone to the full board, and the board gave us the green light on moving ahead with a self-contained elementary program that we actually started last year. The reason we did this is we have some younger students with fairly significant social and emotional challenges. And those students typically would be outplaced at roughly $100,000 per child. We brought those kids back to Rocky Hill, but there was a cost involved. We had to hire 2 certified staff to deal with those children and 3 paraprofessionals. And you could see at the bottom of the slide, the net cost for the personnel was roughly $212,000, but the savings in tuition was $392,000 for a net program savings to the taxpayers of $180,000. So that's important. What's even more important to me as a superintendent, and I know the board agrees with this statement that I'm about to make, is that those kids are now being educated in their home community where they live. That's very valuable from my perspective. They're part of the Rocky Hill schools. They're not on a long bus ride to a private facility somewhere. They're being educated, in this case, at West Hill School, and they're part of our community. So it's really a double benefit. We save overall on the dollars. Even more importantly, we let those kids stay in their home community. Next slide, please. This is just a pie chart, standard way of looking at those data we've discussed throughout the presentation. The big takeaway here is the salaries are 2/3 of the cost. The benefits are another 16%. As I said earlier, any school district in the state that you look at, you're going to find 80 to 85% of the money being spent on personnel. It's no different here in Rocky Hill. Next slide. So we take some pride in this slide too. And by no means are we suggesting that the budget needs to go up by $8.6 million. But if we simply spent what the average school district in Connecticut spent, just the mean, right down the middle, I'd be asking for an $8.6 million increase from the board. If we simply went to the DIRG the DRGD, mean per pupil expenditure, we'd still have to ask the board for another $4.6 million. This is important because DIRG D towns have a similar economic profile, and the average town is spending $17,289 per child. Look at the results we're getting for $15,576. The taxpayers get a great return on their investment. We're getting great results at a below average cost. We also look a little further when we analyze this data. Rocky Hill statewide is number 143 in spending out of 166 school districts. Pretty far toward the bottom in terms of overall educational spending. But in terms of our relative wealth, we're the 59th wealthiest community in the state. So that puts us in the top 35% of wealth statewide. So we're a fairly wealthy town, spending fairly low amount of money on education. And I take that as pride, as a factor of pride for us. We're getting great results at a really efficient cost. It speaks to the vision of our board. It speaks to the administrative team in Rocky Hill working really hard. We don't have a large administrative team. People wear a lot of hats to get things done. And we're really efficient with the dollars we do spend. We just negotiated the bus contract. We came in at about 50%. I give credit on that to Chuck Zettergren. There was an executive order from the governor to negotiate and continue paying bus companies and to negotiate a settlement based on the fact that we're not running transportation right now. Most of the districts we saw were coming in at 80 to 90%, 85%, all over the place. Chuck brought us in at 50%. So again, hard work, diligence, but an efficient use of dollars, I think, is good for the taxpayers. Next slide. This just gives you those data for the state. You can see that this is the most recent data available. They're always a couple years behind. 2 years ago, the high district was spending $36,000 per child. The low district was spending $13 per child. We're at $15,500, ranked 143. Again, we're very efficient, so we take pride in that factor. And we're not requesting that we come up to the state average, but we just want to make it clear that when the board puts a request into the council for funding, it's an efficient request, and we would like to have what the board is requesting because it's based on a really detailed analysis of our expenditures. Next slide. Again, here are some, this is just the DIRG D information. Again, in terms of spending, we're 19th in spending, but we're doing really well in terms of academic results and being efficient. I'm going to spend a little time now talking about the capital improvement program. We took a look at the last 5 years of data, and in the column in blue, you'll see the board's request reflected. And then in the orange column, you'll see what the town actually approved in its adopted budget. So the pattern here is a takeaway of underfunding the board's CIP request. We understand the town's interest in being efficient, but I do want to underscore the fact that you have to spend money on your infrastructure. At the end of the day, the 5 buildings are town assets, and the town benefits from these assets with many programs that are not strictly part of the K-12 educational system. The Park and Rec program, for example, a lot of groups, a lot of travel, sports, and Little League and so forth, indoor practice, Cub Scouts, you name it. These are town facilities. So when the board is coming to you requesting upgrades on areas like a roof that's 26 years old, I'd like the takeaway to be the board is working hard to maintain the assets that it has. They're statutorily under board control, but at the end of the day, they're owned by the town and the taxpayers of Rocky Hill. So these requests they go through a lot of vetting. We spend a lot of time on our facilities, and we don't make these requests for facilities upgrades just out of the blue. They're based on an analysis of data, an analysis of the infrastructure, with an understanding that we are charged with maintaining the integrity of the town's infrastructure. If you could go to the next slide. This is just to give you a picture of pending infrastructure projects in Rocky Hill. Stevens has a 30-year-old roof. It's well past its useful life. I've been in districts where the roofs have leaked. Not a good visual for the town, not for any of us that work in municipal education or on the municipal side of the government. We don't want to deal with that. So it's a 30-year-old roof, well past its useful life. West Hill has a 22-year-old roof. GMS, 26 years old. So what you could see there is that in the next several years, we're facing about $10 million worth of capital projects that really need to be dealt with. The HVAC systems at both Stevens and West Hill, every time we have to do a repair there, it's extremely costly. It would be much better, in my view, to do the full replacement with new equipment, avoid those costly repairs, and also assist with the issue of energy efficiency in terms of reducing utility bills. Next slide. So again, just some ideas related to why we need to fund the CIP. We want to maintain indoor air quality. We want to improve energy efficiency while reducing costs. We need to maintain our teaching spaces and minimize property damage from leaks, failures, and so forth. And again, the emergency repairs. About 5 years ago, the board had to do an emergency repair on a coil in a rooftop unit at West Hill. One system, one rooftop unit in the entire system failed. It was $38,000. Board had to rent a crane, men up on the roof, replacing the coil. 40 grand gone like that because we have an aging system. So, it's kind of the penny wise, pound foolish thing when we avoid dealing with these repairs in a programmatic, systematic approach. Now, with that being said, the board, in light of the coronavirus crisis, recently met and reduced the CIP request. Our CIP was originally going to be at $2.6 million, simply focused on the roof at Stevens for a July 1 start, $1.2 million. And we are asking for $250,000 to deal with smaller projects, miscellaneous repairs, kind of things that can come up during the year that need the attention of the board in order to maintain the facilities. I will say this, I will credit the board and the council. And I've been here 8 years, and every member of the town council and every member of the board that served in the last 8 years has worked well together, from my perspective, to handle our facilities issues. When I came to Rocky Hill, there were splinters the size of magic markers sticking out of gym floors at Stevens School. We had leaking systems, failing systems, The high school was in danger of losing accreditation. Every single counselor and board member for the last 8 years did what they had to improve the facilities. So we've made great progress, but we can't stop the progress. And the problem is when there are gaps in funding, you just pay a bigger price later on. So the board's view is that consistent funding is the way to go about maintaining the facilities so that we don't run into big problems again in the future. Now, just to talk about some highlights in our schools. This year, West Hill School was recognized as a school of distinction for its SBAC performance with high-needs students. West Hill School also is the only elementary school holding this distinction this year. It is the Connecticut Association of Schools State Elementary School of the Year. There's only one in the state, and that's West Hill. It's a big honor. It's an excellent award for that school. The staff worked really hard. It's based on test scores, based on a series of interviews. They do site visits. Fantastic job at West Hill School. Stevens received School of Distinction Award in 2018 for their high needs population. Stevens is producing great results as well. We're very proud of those two schools. We opened Mosier this year. You've all been there. It's a beautiful facility. It's $11 million under budget with that opening. We take great pride in that. Again, the board and the town should share the credit on that project. It's a great situation to come in $11 million under budget. At GMS, our math team, we have some great math students at that school. Just placed third in the Greater Hartford region math competition out of 24 schools. At the high school, I might be most proud of this. We were designated as a unified champion school. This is the program for our special needs kids where they get to participate in unified sports with their non-disabled peers. Very few schools in the state receive this championship designation from the Special Olympics Association, and we did. And it really speaks about the culture at Rocky Hill and the fact that our kids are so welcoming to every child in this town, regardless of disabling condition. That's a really special award in my view. And then again at the high school, the Project Lead the Way Distinguished School for 2021. This is the third consecutive year that the school's been recognized. And that's our pre-engineering program. So they're really doing some outstanding things there with Project Lead the Way. Next slide, just to give you a sense of what happens with our students. Ultimately, we're focused on getting them into college. And you could see here in this particular slide, these are schools where the last 2 to 3 years we've had admissions. So we compete at a national level. Our students are well prepared. Harvard University, Holy Cross, University of South Carolina, University of Tennessee, Notre Dame. It's a national profile for school admissions. So we're very proud of our kids. And at the top of the slide, you'll see that Rocky Hill has a cohort graduation rate of 96%. And that's far above the state average in Connecticut at 88%. That's a 4-year adjusted cohort rate. So that means virtually all of the kids are graduating on time. And the few that aren't typically are in our special needs program where they require a couple of additional years in our transitional program. So we're really proud of those numbers, but we're even more proud of the fact that we put our kids in position to get into extremely competitive schools across the United States. Next slide. This is a slide the council usually likes to see. This year, we have a higher than typical projected surplus, and that's really a function of school being shut down. As I said, we have experienced some lower costs with transportation. Chuck did a great job negotiating about a 50% payment on what we would normally be paying. We aren't paying substitute teachers. There are no spring sports. Those things are accruing at a rate where normally we wouldn't see in a regular year without the coronavirus. So we're projecting that we're going to be able to return about $800,000 to the town on June 30th. And I believe I could speak for the board, and certainly Mr. Dillon can as the chair. If the operating budget is something we can work with, we should be able to return every nickel we have. If there are issues where there are significant cuts to the budget, as has been done in past years, the board has to look at the current surplus and maybe pre-purchase items. That's ultimately going to be a function of the budget that's adopted by the council. But at this point, we're projecting a surplus of $800,000. So again, to wrap it up, the last two slides, you see the increase. We're asking for $46.6 million. It's a 4.29% increase. And the final slide, again, getting very good results at a very below average cost. The board is committed to providing all of our students with an outstanding education. I believe the board does meet that goal each year. And I've added some comments in red in this slide because this does not include, this budget, this 46.6 million, does not include expenses that may be needed in relation to the coronavirus. There's a lot of unknown variables at this point. Do we need additional technology? There's talk about additional nurses or certified nursing assistants. Do we have to provide masks and gloves to staff and students? So personal protective equipment. Are there going to be restrictions on how many kids can go on a bus? These are all unknown variables. And I just point this out again, cautioning that we hope that the $46.6 million is approved because we could be grappling with additional costs that right now are unknown variables, but these are the types of things being discussed. So with that being said, I am finished and I'm happy to turn it back over to Mr. Dillon if he wishes to make any comments, and then we can open it up for questions for the chairman and any administrator that might be able to help.
Thank you, Dr. Zito. I think I just would like to thank the council for their time, and I think we can open the floor up for any questions of the board. I'll turn it over to the mayor.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you, Dr. Zito, and the entire board and everyone here this evening. I just want to say that it's really amazing that given the pandemic situation, how quickly you were able to get on board with distance learning and efficiently create some type of normal environment for all of your students. And that's something that you should be incredibly proud of. And I know that it's a huge testament to your commitment and what you're capable of doing. So thank you so much for that. And where would we like to begin this evening with questions? Does anybody have any questions?
I have a question. Am I the only one?
For the record.
Dr. Zito, thank you as usual. Some impressive numbers. Just a couple of things. I think the thing that surprises me, and Brian, maybe you can comment on this, is the Stevens School roof. It hadn't been mentioned in prior years, and then all of a sudden, we're hit with a 1.2 million proposal. And I know there's a state grant that's being applied for. Was there any reason why this wasn't presented last year or the year before so that we could at least start putting money aside?
I'll start with that. Thank you, John. We've carried all of the projects in our CIP going forward in the out years. We have about $10 million, as Dr. Zito mentioned. The issue really was a year ago, we had an assessment done of all the roofs, and Stevens was unfortunately appears to be in the worst shape of the three. They are all past their useful life. And what we've tried to do is develop a plan for consistent funding of all of our infrastructure needs. I think the one thing the board can't do is count on a large influx of capital improvement dollars or a referendum to solve its infrastructure needs. So with that being said, we revised our CIP to demonstrate basically a consistent plan of funding for all the roofs and the mechanical systems, starting with the one that appeared to be the oldest and has the most issues right now.
Okay, so one of the factors for Stevens School is applying for the grant, because next year or the year after, we can't be guaranteed that it'll be a 46% reimbursement rate, correct?
You're correct. You are correct.
So there is some sort of importance to getting it done this year. Did the STEM for Griswold get pushed back?
Yes. So if you look at the updated capital improvement plan that we presented, the STEM for Griswold has been pushed back. Clearly, we have needs with roofs and mechanical systems. And in light of COVID, we've revised our CIP. Initially, we had a $2.6 million request. In light of COVID and discussions with Dr. Zeno and town staff, we have reduced our CIP. So at this point, projects in the short term, it appears are going to be dragged out a few more years, because in light of the current economic circumstances, I just can't see us asking for $2 to $2.5 million a year in light of what's going on right now.
So what has been the discussions on the Board of Ed, and I have been watching some of the meetings, about lumping all of this in 3 or 4 years into one referendum?
That question is honestly a question for the council. What the board is responsible for doing is developing a capital improvement plan that we can demonstrate a feasible approach to funding all the infrastructure needs of the school. How it's funded and when it's funded is really a function of the council. I will say that one of the things that goes into the plan for the CIP is the fact that we cannot close all the schools at once. We can only fix and repair the schools for large scale projects in the summertime. So part of the planning and process is built around the ability to realistically do the project, get the funding, as well as coordinate activities between other schools.
The report, the report regarding Stevens School roof, was it, in your view, I guess considered like an emergency repair versus it should be done in the next 2 to 3 years?
I think it became the priority of the roofs, John. In regards to that one versus the other one, it became the priority because it is the oldest roofing system that we have of our 3 facilities that are the most outdated, and those being Stevens, West Hill, and GMS. So
Okay.
I think the timing, is really a discussion for the council. But with that being said, the West Hill roofs and the GMS roofs are going to need the same approach in the very near future. So we tried to develop a plan to lay it out with a consistent request for funding, and then, ultimately leave it to the council for a decision.
Okay. Thanks, Brian. My next question, Dr. Zito, with the students learning at home, do you suspect there is any possibility of summer classes for any makeup or anything like that that's maybe needed? I mean, would there be any expenses associated with that if that were to happen? If, like a 3-week summer program were instituted for anybody that may not have had that experience of being in school versus learning from home?
That's a great question. I think it's a question in several communities. At this point, the state has issued no guidance on opening schools for the summer. So when we look at summer programming, we have to look at 2 distinct areas. One area is a mandated area stemming from federal law and also from the state, and that's called extended school year services. And that's very specific for students in special education who have been identified through the planning and placement team process for mandated summer learning because of this particular concern that's related to special ed students with loss of instructional time over the summer and having gaps in their learning. In terms of students that are non-disabled, there is no mandate to provide summer school. As a matter of fact, at this point, we are planning not to offer the optional programs. We offer a couple of small programs in the summer that are enrichment programs, Celebration of Learning, and also another program, Algebra Readiness. It's 10 or 12 kids a year that are going into 8th grade that want to go into algebra. The reality is, at this point, the last conference call I was on, the commissioner hopes to make a decision regarding buildings being open this summer, which has not been made yet, by May 15th. So that would be next Friday. But we are not planning on a large scale summer operation. We are aware that kids, if we can open school in the fall, may come back with significant learning gaps, and we're going to be adjusting our curricula accordingly to deal with that. But right now, we're only focused on handling the special needs kids, and if the buildings are not opened up, we will have to provide distance learning to those students. So that's where we are right now.
Okay. All right. Thanks. And then finally, have you been in contact with Chief Custer about SROs? What's the strategy behind that? Because I know last year it was going to be, retired police officers and things like that. Are you talking to him about adding additional SROs?
We feel like the current structure we had this year actually worked quite well. And I'll explain that. That was it was really 3 officers, 2 school resource officers, and Officer Danahy, the youth officer. And what Lieutenant Phelps was able to do, because we staggered the start times with Mosier coming on board. So what we did is we created a situation where now West Hill and Stevens open at the same time. So with the time staggered throughout the district, we were able to use the existing personnel to cover all 5 schools. And there was a high level of visibility that was not possible in the past, the way the schedule worked. So we were pretty happy with the schedule. So my comment to you tonight would be, as long as we have 3 full-time police officers dedicated to the schools, we feel like we can run a system where the busiest times are covered in terms of morning arrival and afternoon dismissal. So my hope would be 3 officers. I talked to Chief Custer quite a while back about that, but again, with the coronavirus outbreak, everything else going on, I really haven't connected with too many of the town personnel on many issues at all. Many of them are working from home. Most of us are in the office, kind of half schedule, coming in, working from home, as you understand. So we haven't had a conversation in several weeks about that issue.
Okay. Thank you very much. Good job to you and your staff as usual. Thanks.
Thank you, sir.
All right, I'll hop in. Following up, I guess, along the lines of your last comment, Dr. Zeno, have you been coordinating with the Central Connecticut Health District on coronavirus response, or are there other task forces that, I'm sure there's a lot of different ones, but who's the primary entity that you're working with to help coordinate how we're handling this now, preparing for the future?
So that's a great question. So I'm involved on weekly calls with Governor Lamont, weekly calls with the Commissioner of Education, and then we have 2 local resources. We have Charlie Brown, and he's the director of the Connecticut Central Health District. We've had a couple of conversations with Charlie, really right at the beginning of the shutdown. We'll be in touch with him as plans get developed to open up the schools. Now, we also, I was emailing Dr. Ann Milanese the other day. Dr. Ann Milanese is the school district's medical director. Each school district in Connecticut by statute is required to have a medical director who serves as an advisor, deals with kids that may have acute issues, makes referrals and so forth. And Ann and I have been exchanging emails. She's ready to go as well. But I think everybody, quite frankly, is waiting on guidelines to be developed. At this point, Connecticut's not really into even phase 1 of the gating criteria that the federal government has laid out, because our rates haven't fallen far enough. So we're all kind of in a holding pattern, Mr. Duff, to be direct with you. But we do have resources available. Once those criteria are established, we will be working with the health district, Dr. Milanese, and of course our school nurses to help implement any recommendations that are coming forth from the governor.
Thank you. In looking over the CIP as it relates to the Stevens roof, there's also pretty substantial line item related to the HVAC equipment. That amounts over the next 2 years, 1 million next year and 1.4 the next. So that's 2.4 for the HVAC. Is that something that is outside of the project that you're looking to do now, or can that be done at the same time? I thought that we had talked about doing the roof and the HVAC at the same time, but I see there's two different line items in the CIP. So I wasn't sure if you could help
I'll answer
clarify
that
how that
question.
was.
So we've completed the design for the roof. We have not completed the design work for the mechanical systems at Stevens. The roof will go forward. Some of the mechanical improvements may be rooftop, others may not at Stevens. So the roof project is really a standalone project. There's no inherent value to connecting them since we don't have a design in place for the HVAC improvements at Stevens at this time.
And there's no cost savings, I guess, for doing both at the same time or something?
No, because it would really be two different contractors, a roofing versus a mechanical contractor. So inherently, I wouldn't see a tremendous amount of cost savings, especially since we haven't pushed through the feasibility of what type of design system we're going to use at Stevens yet.
And one other thing, as we look at replacing, I guess, over the next several years, 90 years worth of roofs, has the board either done engaged a consultant or done any sort of study to see if there would be a cost savings to bidding out all the remaining work, to package it potentially as a referendum? As we like, let's set Stevens aside for now, but if we look at the remaining work that we have to do, Dr. Zeno mentioned about $10 million in the next several years. Is that a more appealing job if it could be, bid out to one contractor? Have we looked at that at all to help maybe lower the cost of the overall project down?
I'm not sure if it would be, I'm not sure if there would inherently be a big savings since all of the projects have not been designed, but it's certainly within the council's purview to look at the future, whether or not all of the projects should be consolidated into one referendum. If that was the case, the board or the council would then need to proceed and have the design work completed for all these projects and then put out to bid.
Because it's a lot of work, and it is, a shame that apparently it wasn't, maintained previously, or maybe the roofs are just at the end of their natural lives. But, if we are putting off for several years doing repairs to a roof that, was last updated in 1998, which is what I'm seeing here from, West Hill, it seems like we still, this whole time, we're bearing some risk that the roof might fail and, we'll get leaks and things like that could create more damage. So if it's really pressing, it might be something that we have to look at. As much as we're all, I think, referendum out, we want to make sure they're not, carrying more risk than, than we're comfortable with.
I don't think they're pressing to the point where they're an emergency, but these are roofs and mechanical equipment that are beyond their useful life. And I think it's appropriate for the board to start planning and having a dialogue with the council for the planned and future replacement of these in a fiscally responsible manner where we can plan one project at a time. Should the council wish to, look to proceed under a referendum approach, by far the board wouldn't object to getting them all fixed at once. But with that being said, it's our responsibility to give the council a plan to repair and replace the infrastructure that's beyond its useful life at the schools. And that's what we've done at this time.
And then finally, I see there is a proposed item for the $60,000 for the STEM classrooms at GMS. Is that for a consultant? And is that something that is still part of that, I think $250,000 that you had included that you think that you can take care of? Or is that, what's the plan for the STEM classroom? We talked about that, I think, a few times.
Yeah, $60,000 is for the design work related to the GMS STEM classroom wing. At this point, we're solely in the design phase. It's been one of the board's goals to proceed with that. With that being said, though, the board has clearly recognized that the replacement of obsolete roof structures and mechanical equipment has to come before we start the process of adding a science wing onto GMS. But that is a goal of the board. It's in our CIP. And at some point in the near future, we'll at least proceed with the early design stages of that work.
Sorry, I saw one other note here. There's been a lot of talk about shifting the times for schools, especially the high school students. Is that something that, not trying to get you to commit to anything either way on that, but is that something that has a cost attached to it, or is it more coordination? How would that work if it's something that
I
does
can answer
happen?
that if that's all right, Mr. Dillon.
Yeah, I'm going to defer to
So,
the expert. now.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know if I'm the expert, but I could give you the history here. So that question came up, Mr. Duff, when we were getting ready to open Mosier. The board spent a lot of time. Brian was involved in every single one of those meetings, so he could speak to it as well as most of the other board members. And we had numerous conversations because we had to schedule Mosier for the current year. We looked at a lot of research. There is quite a bit of discussion nationally about pushing start times back. The vast majority of the comments that the board received from both students and parents in this community was they preferred to keep the start time close to where it was. The start time at Rocky Hill High School historically for decades had been 7:20. This year it got moved to 7:30. 10 minutes is not a lot of time, a little extra time to sleep in the morning. But at this point, the board worked through an entire process and solicited feedback from the community. And I would say probably 80 to 85% of the feedback was in favor of trying to keep the early start. Parents did not want to push for a later start for that age group. And the board listened to the community, and we started the high school this year with a 7:30 start time. And we have not talked about revisiting that at this point.
Thank you.
Dr. Zeno, I have a question for you. This is Pankaj. Thank you for a great presentation. I attended your Board of Ed presentation as well. Great to see a lot of detail in your slides, and it's really very well done. So thanks for doing a great job. I want to go back to slide 12 and just pick it apart a little bit. Because I think there are two items which strike me as the general increase, right? One is the CIP, which we have really exhausted, really, that topic, like, with our other members. I want to break down a little bit that salary increase of 3.19%, because as they say, that's where the money is, right? Willie said, and whatever that was. So let's break that down. Can you give me a little bit of a high-level breakdown of what part of those increases are teacher-related, administration-related, support staff-related, et cetera, et cetera?
Sure. So when you look at that increase of 3.95% you're referring to, so the overall salary increase in the budget. Yeah. So what you have is for the teachers, for example, it's about $700,000. The overall teacher increase is $1 million, a little over $1 million, about $700,000, and that's split between step movement at $300,000 and wage increases at $400,000. Then we have new staff that came in, as I mentioned, with that behavior program, $128,000. The special ed supervisor salary is built into that factor. And then we also have teachers who qualify for advanced degrees, which moves them up the salary schedule. It's about $125,000. So of the overall increase in terms of salaries for teachers, it's over $1 million. Then we get into non-certified personnel. So that would be not teachers, not administrators. The increase there is about $230,000. And that covers such people like occupational therapists, custodians, nurses, part-time secretary. And then we get into paraprofessionals. The increase there is about $150,000 total. $40,000 of that is contractual wage increases. The paras in the program I mentioned earlier, $80,000. And then we've also got some new special ed paras that have come attached with kids. So there's $150,000 there. So when you start throwing those numbers together, you get close to the 1.4 million.
So the teacher salaries are about 1 million. About
the staffing, the increase in certified staff is a little over $1 million. Staffing costs, okay? The teacher salary contract alone is about 700,000 of that.
700. Okay, thank you. All right, and the step increases, are they contractual as well, or?
The step increases are contractual, yes. So each year of successful experience, a teacher moves up the salary schedule, if you will, until they reach top step. And then there's no movement, but they continue to receive a general wage increase, again, as negotiated with the board.
I guess I'm trying to get a sense of how much of this is, for lack of a better word, like discretionary versus
Not discretionary.
absolutely.
Yeah. It's a negotiated contract. So what the board does is they look at the salary settlements statewide. They look at contracts statewide. They look at salary settlements in the Hartford area. They look at contracts in the Hartford area. They sit down. They follow the state statutes related to teacher contract negotiations, which are governed by state law, and they negotiate the contract. And the other factor that you need to know is that the council always has the statutory authority to have an observer sit in those negotiations. I believe Mimi Thoreau has been representing the council the last few negotiations we've had, faithfully attending our meetings, so she's able to report back. And then once the contract is ratified by the teachers or the administrators, because this rule applies to administrators, and approved by the board, it goes to the council. The council has 30 days to either take no action, in that case it goes into effect, approve, which it would go into effect, or reject the contract, and at that point it would go to arbitration. So there is an avenue for the council to be involved in two ways, as I said. First of all, with the observer, and secondly, with action if the council wishes to take action. What I can tell you is that the overall wage increase in this contract was right around state average. So the teachers in Rocky Hill are fairly well compensated compared to a lot of different professions, but they're right around the average for teachers in the state of Connecticut. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Zeno.
Is there anyone else in the council who wishes to ask a question or perhaps make a comment?
I'd like to make a comment and a question, if I may. First, Dr. Zito and members of the Board of Education, thank you for your presentation. Definitely being done during what I'll call unprecedented times. And I'm sure none of us thought something like this would happen when we were looking to fill these positions. But what I'd like to kind of get an idea, and it may be too early to ask the question, is we've now been doing distant learning for 6 to 8 weeks. What can you kind of just touch on what we've learned from the coronavirus era that we're in right now, and how that may affect education in the future years, as well as regarding where budgets may go?
So that's a really good question. It's something I've actually thought about quite a bit. One of the things we hear at the state level, and we should feel fortunate to some extent to be here in Rocky Hill, is that it's exacerbating some of the inequities that already exist in society. So to be blunt, the urban districts, I think, are having a harder time with this situation than suburban communities like Rocky Hill. And that's a credit to the board and to the council for making sure that we have the resources we need to move forward. And the board being very strategic, for example, with technology. So you asked about potential increases. Technology is an area where I potentially see increased need. We were very, very fortunate, as the mayor mentioned, and she mentioned earlier in her comments, to be able to shut down when the order came from the governor and have a device in every child's hand, grade 2 through 12. And then our tech director was able to go out within a matter of weeks and secure devices, grades kindergarten and first grade. We're also working with preschool students as well. So technology is something that I don't think is going to go away. With that being said, I have a couple of other thoughts, but these are more just kind of personal opinion. I think for some kids, this is working really well. We may find that some families, not just in Rocky Hill, but nationally, have adjusted very well to this and may transition to homeschooling children, going with online programs where they pull their kids out of the private schools. That may happen to some extent. But the other thing to keep in mind regarding school is not only the teaching and learning aspect, but there's a massive social aspect to school. These kids miss their friends, they miss their teachers, they miss participating in the drama club, the softball team. I'll pick on you a little bit, Alan. With your daughter's experience, I know she loved softball, so I'll call her out on that because she was a great kid and I remember her well. But they miss that stuff too. So it's not simply the teaching and learning aspect, but it's also the social aspect. As young as preschool and kindergarten, they love coming to school and interacting with their friends. And then the other major impact you have, obviously, is it's put a tremendous strain on families in terms of bottom line, I mean, custodial daycare issues, to be blunt. You know, families have had to figure out if they're still working. You have a family with a nurse and maybe the husband's a pilot, the wife is a doctor, something like that's going on. They're both still working. They're scrambling for daycare, to be blunt. So there's a lot of issues there. But the takeaway for me, for Rocky Hill, the kids have really risen to the occasion. By and large, working very hard. The teachers have done a great job. They report working longer hours than they do. It's actually easier to teach your kids when they're all in front of you than to teach online. So there's a lot of takeaways, but I don't know if costs will go down. I worry about technology, and I think we might even need to have more technology in reserve, if that makes sense to you.
Thank you.
Hi, good evening. Thank you, Dr. Zeno, for your presentation. Educational to us as always. I appreciate the breakdown. I've got two questions. One goes back to the roof, and whether Brian or Dr. Zeno responds, but just getting to the numbers aspect of it, based on what you've displayed tonight, it sounds like based on a 46% reimbursement, we would get back somewhere around 550,000 or so, if that sounds about right, versus if we wait as little as a year, we could lose potentially all of that reimbursement. Is that the risk we could be taking if by waiting, essentially, to put it in dollars?
Yeah, I would agree with that point. We don't know what the future holds for state reimbursement or what Rocky Hill's grant reimbursement percentage will be in the future. So I would agree with the statement that we know what it is today if the project goes forward today. So that's a fair point. And then the actual amount of reimbursement will be based on the actual cost of the construction project.
Right. Okay. So, and then switching gears completely, but kind of pick up on what Alan Greenspan was just asking. With everything you've learned through this coronavirus process and the home schooling and the distant learning, is this going to be the end of snow days as we know it? Like when we have snow days in the future, can we just do a day of distant learning and we'll stick to a regular schedule? If we've been doing it for 6 weeks, 8 weeks or more, the occasional snow day, would we go to that type of learning?
My reputation is I almost never like to cancel school.
Oh, I know.
So,
so there wouldn't be that many
very,
opportunities, but
the kids tease me, Dr. Zeno, you never give us a break. I say, come on, I grew up in New Hampshire. We don't have to cancel school for half a flake of snow. But with all jokes aside, I'm not sure. That's a great question. It's not the first time I've been asked that question, but we also, you'd have to make sure every kid brought their devices home with them. To throw the teachers into that, it really would be a lost day of instruction. So, again, I don't even know how the state would react, as Chuck's pointed out. So it's a really good question, but we've been pretty lucky. I mean, I joke with some people, this was our payback because we only had 2 snow days all year. It was a really light snow year. And then we are dealing with this, obviously, which is very significant. But in most years, we're averaging 3 or 4 snow days in Rocky Hill. Again, I don't like to close school for very minor weather situations. And I'm up at 4:15 talking to the highway department by 4:30. We're very serious about what we do in terms of safety. But I do think over the years, the media has hyped up the snowstorms. And that's why we see a lot of districts close when we choose to stay open. But that's a great question. I don't have a clear answer to it. My first reaction is no. I wouldn't see us just doing a distance learning day in lieu of a lost day of school. But as Chuck pointed out, that's something that would have to come ultimately from the state, because we are required to adhere to the 180-day school requirement in terms of the legislation.
Thank you.
I just very briefly would like to thank Dr. Zito and his administrative team and the Board of Education for the tremendous amount of work they have done in putting together this budget. And obviously we'll give it very serious consideration.
Thank you, Mr. Rowe.
Yeah, I'd like to thank the board and Dr. Zito for putting together the presentation, as we come to be used to getting so much detail. So thank you. Picking up on Councilor Levine's and Councilor Greenspan's notions, I imagine, though, it'd be a shame to lose their comments regarding continuing distance learning in some mix. You know, and I certainly agree that face-to-face is invaluable, and you have to have the face-to-face. But I would imagine that we wouldn't, you know, we have the technology, we have the gear, and we would maintain a mix of it. Will it ever leave the mix? Even when we get back to the new normal, will it ever leave the mix is, I guess, what my question is. And have you noticed provider service issues with so many more people coming online? You know, cable services, provider service, is that, you know, I know there's no more cell phones interruption in class, but is there a technology, you know, a service provider issue?
We've been pretty fortunate. That's a great question. We were a little worried about service load. A couple things stick out in this experience. There was a surge with Google one day where Google nationally, I think, shut down for several hours, and we're a Google district. So that was an impact. We have our tech staff, we have a hotline. They are responding within 24 hours to troubleshoot issues. So there have been some isolated issues, but for the most part, we've been really pleased with the way this has worked. You know, we've made the best of what I would say is a very challenging situation. Your other question regarding will it ever go away? I think one of the reasons we were able to make a smooth transition is because we were doing elements of distance learning already with the Chromebook initiative. All of the secondary students take their devices home on a daily basis, and they do a lot of their work on those devices. And there already was interaction between teachers and students after hours, if you will, in terms of feedback on lessons, assignments being submitted, teachers getting back to students. So this wasn't completely uncharted territory for the kids. So I already think we were kind of in that hybrid mode to some extent. Obviously, it's been augmented significantly with this crisis.
Thank you. And just a general question, I don't know if Mark or Brian, we did do the statute the other night. Did you hear from the state yet on your application on that roof?
We're still waiting on the council minutes, which have to be submitted so that we can meet the deadline for the first 10 days of May. So actually, Chuck was in contact with the council secretary, Ms. Booth, and we hope to have the minutes within a day or so. So we'd like to get it tomorrow, ideally.
So the minutes, as well as the resolution, are a requirement for the application?
It's a requirement yes, they have to be submitted showing that the council took action.
All set, thanks.
Anybody else? Okay. Well, thank you, Dr. Zito and Mr. Dillon, for your presentation. Very thorough, in-depth analysis, and we will absolutely take everything that you said back to our working table and study it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us tonight.
Okay, so if there is nothing further, I'm going to ask for a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Okay. Is there a second?
Second.
All right. All in favor?
Bye.
Aye.
All right. Good night, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.